And that seems to really be the key thing here, is that Israel is a U.S. ally, Russia is a U.S. enemy. Some of the anti-BDS, the state level anti-BDS legislation even specifically uses that language.
The Electronic Intifada.
The Electronic Intifada.
The Electronic Intifada.
This is the Electronic Intifada podcast. I'm Nora Barrows Friedman.
And I'm Asa Winstanley.
And welcome back to the Electronic Intifada podcast. I'm Nora Barrows Friedman with Asa Winstanley. And Asa, we have a great interview coming up in a few minutes with Olivia Katby of the Palestinian Boycott National Committee, the BNC. And in that interview, which was done last week, we talked a little bit about the DSA, the Democratic Socialists of America. And Olivia is a member of the DSA, but she was speaking to us in her capacity as a BNC coordinator. But since that interview, the DSA has basically obliterated the Palestine Working Group and has, kind of nuked the BDS capacity of the DSA. So we wanted to kind of get a little update from someone who's been following this very carefully, Omar Zaza, who's an activist and a writer and contributor to the Electronic Intifada. Omar, thank you so much for being with us again on the EI podcast. I think you've been on at least once before.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, this sounds to me a little bit like the pure chicanery that has been happening in the Labour Party over the last, since 2015, really. It just sounds like pure backstabbing, basically.
Yeah. Give us an update.
There was a lot of that
happened.
going on the Labour Party left over the last few years, especially. So,
Amazing.
Talk us through this a bit. Explain it to me.
Yeah. Thank you again. So basically, I think as both of you have been following, like all of this really, it didn't actually start with Bowman, but I think publicly is when it really came into focus with Bowman. So as you may
Jamal
recall,
Bowman, the congressman, right?
Yeah, there was basically the Palestine Solidarity and BDS Working Group of the DSA, led the charge to, call on the DSA to basically expel Jamal Bowman because, for his votes for replenished funding for the Iron Dome, but also for his really opportunistic, taking of J Street junkets, to the Israeli state. It's appearing at J Street, town halls, basically to, talk to them about whatever it is. Basically, it's normalization of J Street, and in addition to this funding, right? So after that happened, the working group, led a charge to have Bowman expelled from the DSA. And this was interesting because I think it's one of those, what you'd call kind of the mask off moments for people who claim to support, Palestinian liberation. And then you realize, there's kind of a parentheses there. They support Palestinian liberation unless you attack a politician they like, and then they sort of come out, full Zionist essentially. And that's kind of what happened. It was interesting to watch the way that this split, even the droves of supporters or erstwhile supporters, people saying that, this is just a rogue band of activists or wreckers or people who really have no idea how electoral politics work, all of this stuff. And meanwhile, the NPC issued some kind of a backpedaling thing saying, well, what we're going to do is we're going to give him one more opportunity to prove he's an ally to the Palestinian people. And then, if he does not fulfill that, we'll, whatever.
And the NPC is like the national leadership body of the DSA, right?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
It stands for National Political Committee. They're basically the highest decision-making body. They're the, by what they like to constantly refrain at this point, the democratically elected leadership of the DSA. Mm-hmm. So, after that happened, it sort of, I think this is the difference. Like there had been tensions between the working group and the NPC for some time, but the Bowman issue is what really brought it into focus. And I think the Bowman issue is what in many ways accelerated it, right? So basically, now we're at a point where, I wrote about this for Mondoweiss, the NPC actually decided to go ahead and nuke the Palestine Solidarity and BDS working group. And, the language they use in the DSA is dechartering. And what that means is that the working group is officially disbanded. And they say that, it's going to be folded into their international committee. So, an organization that's tasked with international work, as though Palestine has nothing to do with the United States, because it's not like we have anti-BDS laws. It's not like, we have politicians who continuously vote for replenishing, Israeli genocide or anything like that. And the other issue with that, though, I think in addition, this is important to know, in addition to the kind of principle of why this is offensive, is that leadership is also going to be handpicked by the NPC. So it's basically, we're throwing you into an organization that is tasked with international work. We're handpicking the leadership that's going to manage you. And, it also, basically, this is a punishment for the working group within the DSA. They are not allowed to have, the steering committee members are not allowed to hold hold national leadership positions for 1 year. So they're basically on some kind of probation, basically for their principled work for Palestine.
DSA, Democratic Socialists of America. It doesn't sound very democratic, but it does sound quite American. Or British for that matter, like hand-picked sort of puppet leaders.
Right.
Exactly. Yeah. And I guess one other thing I'll kind of throw in here is that I think it's important for the viewership to understand, how the process of, politicians being endorsed by the DSA works. And, there's basically 2 tracks for this, right? One track is that you're actually a DSA member, and who decides eventually to run for some kind of political office, and you run fully on DSA principles, and that's what's called a cadre candidate, versus there are politicians who will seek DSA endorsements, who were not previously DSA members, and that's what happened with Jamal Bowman. And so, you still need to go through some kind of a vetting process for this. You need to be vetted by a local chapter and by a national chapter. By the national, before you're actually endorsed in this way. But what we found, is that actually what had happened is that for his national endorsement form, Jamal Bowman had said he is explicitly against, and he would vote against funding, right? Funding Israeli military funding. But then what has happened, and this is the other really ridiculous thing, is that revelations keep coming out that show that the NPC was basically duped by this canny politician, and they continue to double down and attack the working group because I think they embarrassed them so badly for being such incompetent leaders. Right?
Yeah.
But so in an interview recently, Bowman said that he would have always voted. He said, voting for the Iron Dome is something I would have always voted for, even if it was independent. Right. So this is important because I think, to be fair and kind of throw people a bone, like these.
Sorry, even if what was independent?
Even if
he wasn't endorsed by the DSA.
Right.
Even if funding for the Iron Dome had been presented within an independent context, he said, I would have voted for that. He says, I voted yes for that, and I would have voted for that on principle in general. Okay. So he kind of eliminated this pretense that politicians often use, which is, that these sometimes funding for Iron Dome or funding for other things is smuggled into larger packages. In this case, he said, literally, I voted for it on principle, and I would vote for it again. Regardless of whatever the pretense for it is.
So what is the DSA leadership's justification for that? How are they sort of justifying Bowman on that? Are they saying this is okay what he's done, or are they just sort of saying, oh well, we may disagree with him, but he's still a good comrade?
Well, what they're saying, I mean, this is kind of like, people who are kind of cultists for Biden at this point. Bowman can still move left. We shouldn't be we shouldn't be punishing people who are, as you're saying, good comrades who can eventually come around. Really, actually, their ultimate excuse is that, they're claiming that the Palestine Working Group was being antagonistic, was bullying, was engaging in all of these hostile behaviors, and they had no choice, as a good leadership.
Sounds
but-
very
Wow.
familiar to me.
Yeah, a little
Yes.
bit.
Bullying, yeah.
And this is the Palestine exception. This is only applied to people who are advocating for Palestinian rights and advocating for the US government to stop funding human rights violations against Palestinians. I mean, this is, and what this also points to is that there is a rot in the system, even on the so-called, progressive, left leaning section of the political establishment, that the DSA is so willing to throw Palestinians under the bus in order to get closer to the center of power and not be an opposition party to the Democrats, the neoliberal Democrats, but essentially, work with them and basically support them when it comes to standing by Israel. It's despicable.
Yes, 100%, and I think it's also important to note that at the end of the day, a lot of these folks wear many hats, and they're not just DSA, and I'm talking more about the NPC and the higher echelons of the DSA at this point. Many of them actually have relationships with Bowman's office, right? And they're invested in having some kind of career through that. They're invested in doing things like being, perhaps chosen individuals to work on the campaigns that he's going to initiate. For example, the Green New Deal is very big. He's got the Green New Deal for Public Schools Act. And so this is kind of a known conflict of interest, but it's not one that's ever really been able to be called out before. And, that's at the end of the day, you have this large, national organization, you claim all these socialist values, but you can still be somebody apparently who's really in it for your own career interests rather than actually advancing socialism. And there's no way to actually hold that to account within the organization, which is troubling.
That's exactly the same problem in the Labour Party. That during the Jeremy Corbyn years, it was exactly the same thing. There was this whole layer of young opportunists, I would say, who wanted a career in the Labour Party, albeit under the sort of Corbynite wing, the Labour left wing. And quite often these people basically smothered the project, as they called it. There's this jargon of the project, and it was all a bit vague what the project meant anyway, of Corbynism. And yeah, the whole impetus of being desperate for jobs and being proximate to the centers of power really undermined any kind of actually existing socialism coming out on top in the Labour Party. And it sounds like a very familiar thing.
Finally, Omar, what, you've been following this very closely. What are people within the BDS working group at the DSA doing right now? What is there any sort of organizing or appeals, to the national leadership of the party to reverse course and take Palestinian rights seriously?
Yeah, thank you for asking that. Right now, as of right now, there is a statement that's been written by the working group, basically calling on the national leadership to reverse its decision to decharter. And they're asking for sign-ons to that. They also have a forum for people to email the national leadership, basically reiterating that message. And, I think also more broadly, it's really important to continue to call attention to this and to really vocally, publicly oppose the NPC's actions and say, again, that as you said, this is a Palestine exception. This has nothing to do with socialism. This is basically just, honestly, it's mask off fascism at this point.
Yeah, the method used to do this is literally a fascist method, mass reporting a Twitter account that you disagree with because, to Twitter. That is literally what fascists do to left-wing accounts, and it's unfortunate this has come from a so-called left-wing organization.
Right.
Exactly. And mass reporting it after you've already nuked their website. So this was up until this point, the last refuge that they had to communicate. So this is a very, calculated measure to make sure that the working group has no means of communicating to its followers, right?
Amazing. Well, Omar Zaza, thank you so much for giving us a quick update. Before we head into our fantastic interview with Olivia Katby of the BNC coming up in just a minute. Omar Zaza, you can read their reports on the Electronic Intifada. You're also with Eyewitness Palestine and Palestinian Youth Movement. Thank you so much, and we'll be right back. Welcome back to the Electronic Intifada podcast. I'm Nora Barrows-Friedman with Asa Winstanley. As institutions and political bodies in Western countries initiate sweeping boycotts of Russian products, cultural figures, athletes, and corporations over the invasion of Ukraine, it has suddenly become justifiable. But as our colleague Tamara Nassar points out, quote, apparently only as long as it is Russia. Astonishingly, many of the anti-Russia measures are being implemented by the very same organizations that repeatedly ignored or rejected Palestinian calls to sanction Israel, their oppressor. As friend of the show, Joseph Massad recently wrote in Middle East Eye, quote, the Russophobic campaign straddles the entire Western political spectrum, and it is fully endorsed by Western liberals and cultural elites. To help us make sense of the current situation is Olivia Katby, the North American coordinator with the Palestinian BDS National Committee, or the BNC, the coalition of Palestinian organizations that leads and supports the BDS movement worldwide. She joins us from Portland, Oregon. Olivia, thank you so much for being with us on the Electronic Intifada podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. Longtime listener. Second time caller, maybe? Maybe
I think so, yeah. Well, it's good to have you back. Let's talk about the statement that was recently issued by the BNC that points out and calls to attention the absurd hypocrisy of what we're seeing around the world. We see the rush by corporations to end all their business ties to Russia. Symphonies are now firing Russian musicians if they don't sign a pledge pledging, to hate Russia as much as Americans are supposed to. Universities and cultural institutions are banning books and cultural work by long dead Russian authors and artists. Or even the banning of Russian cats at cat shows, when at the same time, the BDS movement has been constantly smeared and vilified by major corporations and institutions. Can you comment on what's happening and lay out how the BNC puts it, the West's response to the Russian invasion demolishes excuses for rejecting BDS against apartheid Israel?
Totally. As you mentioned, the statement that we put out cites the way that all of these politicians and corporations, and even nonprofits and community groups in the US and the West are rushing to boycott, divest from, and sanction Russia. They're putting out statements that say they stand with Ukraine. And many of these same individuals and entities either say, when they're asked to do the same for Palestine, they say that they either can't make political decisions, they don't get involved in foreign policy, or even worse, they are the same politicians and same organizations who have been working to demonize and criminalize boycotts, divestments, and sanctions against Israel. We have politicians in the US who are trying to pass laws to criminalize BDS at the state level and are also pushing their states to boycott and divest from Russia. Governors are a great example. Governors of all 50 states signed an anti-BDS letter a couple years ago. Now we're seeing a wave of governors ordering their state-run liquor stores to de-shelve Russian vodka. Here in Oregon, we have had activists, unions, even some members of Congress call on our state to divest from NSO, the Israeli spyware company that has a long list of human rights violations. The Oregon Pension Fund is actually one of the largest investors in the private equity firm that owns NSO. Our state treasurer and the Oregon Investment Council told us they can't divest from NSO because they are not allowed to make political decisions. They have to invest based on what's a good investment, even though NSO is obviously a bad investment now that it's even been blacklisted by the Biden administration. But anyway, 2 weeks ago, same state treasurer put out a statement saying he was directing the Oregon Investment Council to divest from Oregon's Russian assets because the state of Oregon stands with Ukraine. That is what he said. A very clear political statement. So the hypocrisy is so incredible to witness here, and just lies. We can't make political decisions, but you can make political decisions for your allies. And that seems to really be the key thing here, is that Israel is a US ally, Russia is a US enemy. Some of the anti-BDS, the state level anti-BDS legislation even specifically uses that language, says you cannot target Israel as a US ally with boycotts. And that's unfortunately the underlying current that we're seeing here. There are no universal principles of respecting human rights and international law and, opposing illegal or immoral actions. It's just about who is a US ally and who is an enemy. And I think last what I want to say here is that when these politicians and businesses are taking these actions against Russia, it's not BDS. We wouldn't use the BDS acronym to describe the actions they're taking, because BDS is a very specific call for very specific actions based on complicity, not based on identity or political opinion. And so with Russia, we are seeing, like you said, individual musicians targeted because they happen to be Russian, dead Russian writers, Russian cats. BDS does not call for a boycott of individuals because they happen to be Israeli or because of their political opinion. Obviously people can make their own decisions. That is not what the BDS movement calls for. We call for boycotting institutions and companies that are complicit in Israel's regime of apartheid and occupation, and only in circumstances where individuals are either representing the Israeli state or a complicit institution, or are participating in, those sort of like rebrand Israel efforts, then that might be grounds for a boycott. But it is really context sensitive depending on level of complicity. And that is not the case with what we're seeing with Russia, not to mention the sanctions piece and how different that is than what BDS calls for. And we can get into that.
Yeah, what you say about the justification for opposing BDS being that you're not allowed to make political decisions. We've kind of seen this in the UK as well, except that the Tory government has just made it explicit. Like they just say, well, you can't, local government is not allowed to make decisions that differ from the national government. So, and British government policy is to support Israel. So you're not allowed to do any kind of
Right.
sanction that goes against national government policy.
Right.
So, I mean, we see these efforts, although, I mean, I guess the British government keeps saying they're going to change the law to ban BDS, but they're still not quite doing it. And personally, I don't think they will be able to do it either. It's a bit of a tangent there, but do you have a view on that?
Yeah, I mean,
with it?
I don't have a view specifically on what is happening in the UK, but I would say I think it just goes back to, Israel is their ally and Russia is not, and that's what it comes down to. Yeah.
So we've seen some self-proclaimed progressives that have insinuated that if you support the BDS movement, then you should also support sanctions on Russia, as if these are the same thing. Can you talk a bit about the difference between US or Western-led imperialist sanctions being tightened against Russia as they are against many other countries around the world, which are, quite often socialist in character, or at least are perceived to be official enemies of the United States? Can you talk about the difference between those kinds of sanctions and the kind of sanctions that the BDS campaign calls for?
Yeah, definitely. So the call for sanctions from the BDS movement is very different from the very brutal and crippling sanctions imposed by the US and other Western powers on their enemies, like those we are now seeing started to be imposed on Russia and, on Iran, Iraq, Cuba, Venezuela. These kinds of illegal and immoral sanctions are, by design, their intention is to strangle the general population. They restrict access to food, medicine, energy, other resources that people need to survive, essentially with the goal of inciting a revolt. The US government has said this, they strangle the people and they hope that people will blame their government and revolt and potentially overthrow it if their government fails to comply with US or NATO demands. Most famously, I think that the very brutal US-led sanctions imposed on Iraq in the 1990s are a great example of these kind of sanctions. You know, those sanctions on Iraq were estimated to have caused the deaths of over 500,000 children. And, you know, we knew that was intentional. Everyone said it was intentional. You know, it was not just, oops, collateral damage. You know, very famously, when she was asked about the 500,000 children dead, Madeleine Albright responded, "We think the price is worth it." So the difference is that the sanctions we are calling for in the BDS movement are first and foremost about governments just fulfilling their legal obligations to end Israeli apartheid and not aid or assist in its maintenance. So that means banning business with illegal Israeli settlements and apartheid, and ending military security funding, trade and research, canceling free trade agreements, as well as suspending Israel's membership in international forums like FIFA, you know, things that are so hypocritically on display now with Russia. But the foremost demand of the BDS movement is to end complicity. And that is really front and center what we mean when we call for sanctions. So the US not only, as we know, they fight any attempts to hold Israel accountable to international law, but we also provide Israel with nearly $4 billion a year in military funding. So ending US military funding of Israel, you know, that's not even a call for sanctions, but for fulfilling a legal obligation to stop supporting Israel's crimes against Palestinians. You know, that is not something that's designed to hurt innocent people, but it is something that we are framing as a sanction when we call for sanctions with BDS, and that's how it differs from these illegal, immoral sanctions that the West imposes on its enemies.
Olivia, what can you say? I mean, more, you know, kind of circling back to just the like astonishing hypocrisy and double standards being applied to Russia, while, you know, institutions keep making up excuses of why they can't hold Israel accountable or respond to calls for the boycott of apartheid Israel. The other day, you were tweeting about this. The Sierra Club, you know, had announced that it was hearing from, you know, BDS campaigners and Palestinians who were protesting the trips that the Sierra Club was planning to take to Israel as kind of, you know, I mean, we all see it as part of Israel's greenwashing campaign, of course, to try and like portray Israel as this like beacon of, you know, ecological, environmental protection and you know, all of that. So as soon as the Sierra Club announced that they were going to not, you know, hold these trips to Israel, the Israel lobby went into full, you know, damage control mode and ended up pressuring the Sierra Club to reverse its decision just a couple of days later. You know, and they said this whole thing of, you know, we don't want to take a political stand. This is, you know, we don't believe in politics. We believe in environmentalism. Meanwhile, they also published a statement on Ukraine. So what can you say about this as kind of an example of what we talk about when we talk about institutional double standards?
Yeah, the Sierra Club is, another great example of this hypocrisy we've been talking about. Like you said, they put out a statement not too long ago saying that they stand in solidarity with Ukraine. Someone had flagged for us last month that the Sierra Club had these outings scheduled to Israel for this month that are essentially greenwashing trips, you know, framing Israel as a beacon of environmentalism, gonna go do bird watching, saying nothing about Palestinians or the occupation, though I think the description of one of the trips mentioned a Palestinian sunbird, which was kind of funny to us. So we got a coalition together of Palestinian organizations, the Movement for Black Lives was in the room, Indian Collective, which is an indigenous organization, Jewish Voice for Peace, and we met with some of the executives in the Sierra Club, and they were sent by Dan Chu, the CEO, who was not in these meetings, but he like empowered them to make a decision. And they actually did recommend to him that they not go forward with these trips you know, the Sierra Club has been in a moment of trying to reckon with their very racist history as an environmental organization. And they've made statements in recent years, many statements about standing up for Black lives. In these meetings, you know, they were all acknowledging what unceded territory they were calling in from when doing introductions. And we were just like, this is so tone deaf unless you're going to cancel these trips. So we were giving them, you know, this opportunity to work with us. Once it got out, you know, the ADL began pressuring them, the backlash began, big name funders were pressuring them. And then Dan Chu, the CEO, came out with a statement saying it was a hasty mistake. They'll reschedule the trips to Israel for the summer. And when we talked to him, he was trying to say, oh, we thought you just wanted to help us make these trips more balanced, essentially, I guess maybe setting them up to meet with a Palestinian.
Right.
So the word Palestine or Palestinian never even came out of his mouth.
This is a trend, like in
amazing.
recent years. Like it's
Yeah.
a real, quite strong trend with the Israel lobby in the last few years on the more liberal end, where they try and say, well, you can just still do these trips, and you can also visit with Palestinians. You know,
Right.
as well.
Yeah, play our
They're trying to
concert in Tel
balance it
Aviv. You
out.
can also play a concert in Ramallah if
Yeah.
the Palestinians
Yeah.
want you to. Yeah.
Yeah,
Right.
so we were very clear that no, this is an active picket line from the people indigenous to the land, and you are crossing it. And there's no way to make a trip to an apartheid state fair and balanced. There are no two sides, or there are, you know, occupier and occupied, apartheid state and those subjected to apartheid. Those are the two sides that you are talking about here. And now you are taking the side of the apartheid regime. So that's what happened with the Sierra Club. And I think, you know, more broadly, this is an opportunity for us to first to point out the hypocrisy of these organizations like the Sierra Club, universities, other, you know, organizations that try to present themselves as progressive, who are issuing statements, standing in solidarity with Ukraine, instituting divestment policies against Russia, boycotting Russia, you know, saying essentially, we have asked you to do the same thing. You have refused for these reasons. Now you're going back on your word and you're suddenly able to take these kinds of actions. I think a lot of the time, corporations and institutions say they respect human rights, especially corporations. A lot of them have like corporate human rights policies. They don't actually act on them. And this is actually the first time for many entities that we're seeing them act on their quote unquote values. So I think we should use that to hold their feet to the fire. General Mills is another example. General Mills is a target of the BDS movement because they own Pillsbury and they manufacture Pillsbury products in the Adarat industrial zone, which is illegally occupied Palestinian land. They have a corporate human rights policy. They have repeatedly told us that they cannot do anything about this. They're respecting the rights of Palestinians who work at these factories. They basically use Palestinians as like a diversity quota. Like it's excusable to do business in an occupation because we're providing jobs to Palestinians.
Right.
Now they are withdrawing their business from Russia. And this is an opportunity for us to point out for companies like General Mills, for other actors like, hey, by taking this action against Russia, you're setting this precedent for yourself now. We're just holding you to your own standards that you are setting here with your actions.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're gonna see more of that. So, yeah, I've been thinking that a lot recently over the last few weeks with all this. I mean, to me, it's hysteria, like it's anti-Russian hysteria, where it's more like people want to be seen to be doing something about the bad thing, and so therefore it's like, hey, you know, I stand with Ukraine, and
Right,
there's
and this
no
is like an uncontroversial position.
Yeah, and you've literally got Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister of Britain. Sorry to bring it back to Britain again. You know. Anyway, yes. Yeah, Boris Johnson coming on to a video on Twitter and saying, "Slava Ukraine," like glory to Ukraine. This literally fascist slogan. And it's like, yeah, I mean, you know. I read that Netflix dropped an adaptation of Anna Karenina because it was written by Leo Tolstoy, who's this, you know, long dead Russian pacifist, as we've mentioned, I suppose. But I mean, so it is kind of crazy, and it's like people are not thinking the implications through of how is this actually helping the situation? How is it a targeted boycott in any way? It's just, well, Russian's bad, let's boycott everything Russian. and BDS has always been the antithesis of that. But at the same time, on a simple level, I suppose it is like you've been saying, it is going to set precedents for people in a way where it's going to be able to make people think again of sort of like, well, actually, yeah, we just boycotted everything Russian. So what's actually so bad about a targeted boycott?
Strategic, right?
Against
They're
complicit companies.
They're no longer able to say we can't take positions on foreign policy issues.
Right.
Yeah, and it makes, I suppose I mean, we all know that like these rules are not universal and they're not going to be applied in the same way. However, it will make it harder in these sort of ways for these kind of pretexts to be put up. So how do you think that that people on the left and BDS activists, especially students and trade union activists who've been trying to pressure their universities, for example, to break institutional ties with Israeli companies and Israeli institutions that are complicit involved in the occupation of Palestine. How do you think those kinds of activists can, use, I suppose, this kind of moment and these kind of precedents that are being set to their advantage in the BDS movement in the near future?
Yeah, like I said, I think this is just an opportunity for us to point out like that these actors, universities, governments, institutions are setting a precedent for themselves. I think, for example, here in Oregon, where we've been campaigning against NSO and our state's investment in NSO, they've told us they can't take a position on foreign policy issues. They have to do it on whether or not it's a good investment. Now they're making a political statement on standing with Ukraine and divesting from Russian assets, which I think the state of Oregon has like $122 million of Russian assets versus the almost 300 million that they invested in Novopina Capital, which is the private equity firm that owns NSO.
Right.
And so I think,
Amazing.
They are setting a precedent for themselves now. We know that you can take this kind of action. You are doing it right now. Not to mention, it is a bad investment. I think, like you said, Asa, it will make it harder for them to weasel out of not being able, everyone always says our hands are tied. That's the most common response we get when we go up against big institutions with BDS campaigns. And now they are proving to us that that's not true. I think it will make it a little easier.
Well, finally, this is also an opportunity to put even more pressure on politicians who are, changing their avatars to the Ukrainian flag while, professing to be progressive or anti-war. I think it would be good to talk about kind of how grassroots activists, anti-war activists, BDS campaigners can use this opportunity to pressure progressives, especially as the midterm elections approach. Can you talk a little bit about people like Jamal Bowman, who was supported by the DSA and had espoused a lot of Palestine, rights language before his election, and now has really backtracked. As a BNC representative, what can you say about the positions of people like? As a BNC representative, what can you say about the positions of people like Bowman and other progressives who are, saying that they stand with Ukraine, that they support a boycott of Russia, but when it comes to Israel, that's a step too far. What can people do now? Yeah,
so I think probably some people listening to this will know that I'm a DSA member. For full disclosure, I've been active in DSA since 2016, but I'm speaking here as the North America coordinator for the BDS movement. I think we can talk another time about my perspective as a DSA member.
Yes.
But I think BDS movement has been really excited about partnering with DSA ever since the organization endorsed BDS in 2017 and then founded the National BDS and Palestine Solidarity Working Group in 2019 to commit not just in principle to BDS, but in taking action. And I know one of the tasks of that working group has been to give DSA chapters and organizers in the national organization the political education and resources needed so that situations like the controversy around Bowman are avoided in the future. As the BNC, we don't interfere in like decisions like DSA and political parties in other countries make. We did put out a statement recently reiterating our long-held positions, the first being that the BDS call is a picket line, and traveling to Israel on propaganda trips, meeting with the Israeli prime minister, that is crossing the picket line. We also pointed out our principles on accountability and context sensitivity when it comes to politicians and their positions on BDS and on Israel. The US is not the center of the world. There are so many political parties around the world who deal with these same issues, some who deal with them well, some who do not. And I think it would be good for DSA to take lessons from these parties. I mean, Chile just elected a pro-BDS president. That is massive. So, the US is not the center of the world, but it is the center of support and military funding and providing international legitimacy for Israel. And so I think it's crucially important that organizations like DSA, who are having this huge rise in US politics, take that seriously. And I think that the fact that this was such a huge controversy, everyone was talking about it. So many media articles came out about it. I think it shows that they are taking it seriously. And there is a lot of action being taken inside the organization to prevent this from happening in the future.
That's great. My Siberian cat is behind us. His ears were perked when we were talking about cats. We are not boycotting him in this house.
Oh yeah, he's Siberian. Okay.
Yeah, he is. He's a great guy. He always wants attention when the microphone is on. Finally, Olivia, what are some of the kind of most significant BDS campaigns in the US and Europe or around the world that the BNC is supporting, and what are you kind of anticipating in this next coming year of campaigning?
Yeah, actually, I don't know if you saw, but some big news just came out this morning about the Deadly Exchange campaign, which is a campaign that was launched by Jewish Voice for Peace to end police exchanges between US police officers and Israeli police and military. A lot of those exchanges are facilitated by the ADL. And the ADL had this memo from 2020 that was leaked where they were really questioning, continuing these exchanges because of this campaign, saying, oh, are we actually doing a bad thing? Are US police officers coming back and instituting more racist, more harmful practices because they have trained with the Israeli military? And in that memo, they came to the conclusion that maybe we should end these trips because there's been so much controversy created by this campaign by Jewish Voice for Peace. Now they have decided, because this memo has come out, they're saying, no, we want to continue our commit. We're very committed to law enforcement, and we're actually going to expand these programs. So they are doubling down.
Of course. Of course.
But,
predictable.
They did pause the exchanges for almost 3 years. And, of course, they'll blame the pandemic, but right. It's very clear that they were internally contemplating completely ending them because of this campaign. So I think it's an opportunity now for us to escalate this campaign. And it's just the ADL showing what their values are. They're doubling down on their commitment to the racist US police. And the ADL is actually the largest non-governmental trainer of US law enforcement, including ICE officers. And so I think it is a line in the sand, should be a line in the sand for progressives, that the ADL is not a progressive ally. And I think it is a big opportunity for the Deadly Exchange campaign. Another big campaign happening in the US right now is a campaign called No Tech for Apartheid, which is being led by workers in Google and Amazon who are opposing their employer's contract, $1.2 billion contract for a cloud with the Israeli government, over 1,000 workers signed an open letter to their employers, which is, very dangerous for them. Google has retaliated against some of them. But it's a really good opportunity to highlight the way that the tech industry at large is so complicit in repression of human rights and in apartheid in Israel. And it's really cool that it's being led by the workers in these companies who are saying, we just want to make tech to help people. We don't want it to be used for this horrible purpose. Yeah, there's a lot of other campaigns happening, like locally in small coalitions around the US. And I think this is going to be a really good year to re-energize BDS campaigning.
It's amazing. Like this, I mean, this is practically breaking news as we're filming this, so it's kind of going to date the episode when it comes out, but that's okay. I mean, it is amazing that this. I haven't had a chance to actually read what's the details of it, but the fact that this was even contemplated by the ADL is massive, because this is. I mean, Nora, we should do a whole episode about.
Oh yeah, we totally should. Yeah,
like the history of the ADL. People don't know that the ADL. I mean, we know, but I think in America, the ADL is a very well-known organization publicly, as allegedly a group that stands for civil rights, as a group that defends Jewish people, but actually it has this history of not only acting as a lobby group for Israel, but of literally operating, aspiring, targeting American citizens, and spying for Israel, and spying in the 80s for the apartheid state of South Africa, and selling these files, this information on mostly American leftists and Arab groups and Palestine solidarity groups, Black activist groups in solidarity with South Africans living under the former apartheid regime. And it operated this spy ring, there's a whole fascinating history there. So for a group that is so deeply in bed with Israel to even contemplate ending these deadly exchange police training programs, I think is, it does show that, like, it's in the there's this cliche of they don't call it the struggle for nothing. Like these kind of long-term campaigns are hard. Like people work on them for so long, and you just keep plugging away. I know, as journalists writing about this area as well, we're always constantly repeating ourselves, and it gets weary, and it is a struggle, but it shows that struggle can work. Struggle works, and it's a long haul thing.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned their long history of spying, because one of the things that police officers who went on these trips to Israel noted was like Israeli surveillance and how they used plainclothes officers in a way. Many of the police officers, actually, the American police officers said, we can't do most of the stuff that they're doing because it's illegal. We would be in jail. It's illegal. It's unconstitutional. Not that ever stops U.S. police officers from doing things, but
in what
Right.
way? Like what exact way were they using?
Particularly commented on the brutal methods of arrest that Israeli police used.
Undercovers.
They commented on the Hollywood style level of surveillance that they use against Palestinians, and specifically the way that they utilize plainclothes officers, in addition to like all the crazy surveillance technology, just the way that they utilize officers for spying.
Yeah, I mean, as you'll know, Olivia, but to explain to our listeners and viewers that it's very common for Israeli forces in the West Bank to use undercover officers to arrest Palestinians who are dressed as Palestinians, as consciously dressed up, and they infiltrate Palestinian communities in order to brutally arrest sometimes children, for whatever it is, on the pretext of whatever.
And the ADL is going to be doubling down on sharing those values with U.S. police forces.
Right.
Just astonishing.
Civil rights.
Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly. For some. definitely not for all.
Mm.
Olivia, give us the details of how people can link up with the BNC and where they can find you on Twitter.
Totally. We have a lot of different BDS campaigns happening across the US. If you go to our website, bdsmovement.net, go to get involved. You can find some groups that are working on BDS there. Follow the BDS movement on Twitter at BDS movement. You can follow me on Twitter at Olivia Catby. Yeah, thanks so much for
Awesome.
having me.
Olivia, thank you so much for being with us on the Electronic Intifada podcast.
Thank
and
you.
we will check in with you in the near future. Absolutely. As these campaigns continue.
Great. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching this video. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel, hit like, leave a comment. These engagements help us with the YouTube algorithm, and it helps us to get around Silicon Valley censorship as much as possible. It does make a difference. You can also support our journalism by going to electronicintifada.net and clicking on donate now. Thank you.